The journey of a black man, navigating the streets of a city that's both home and battlefield, begins long before the wheels of his bus start turning each day. For Marcus, the bus driver, each mile traveled is a constant reminder of the barriers he's faced, the prejudices he's endured, and the strength he's had to summon just to survive. Raised in a neighborhood where opportunities were few and challenges were many, Marcus grew up with an understanding that his skin color, his identity, would define much of his life. It was a harsh truth, one that he learned early on when, as a young boy, he witnessed an older cousin beaten by the police for simply standing in the wrong place at the wrong time. His mother would often speak about the cruelty of the world, but her words were always wrapped in love and hope, teaching Marcus that while the world could be unforgiving, he could still choose to rise above it. As a child, Marcus found solace in his dreams of leaving the struggles behind. His mother worked long hours, often cleaning office buildings late into the night, while his father, absent for much of his life, left him with only a distant memory. It was the quiet moments in the corner of his small room, with his eyes gazing out at the stars, that he swore he would rise above the hate, the labels, and the barriers that had been cast before him. But the world, as he would come to understand, was not going to make that path easy. Every day, Marcus put on his uniform, took a deep breath, and climbed into his bus, ready to face a world of subtle and sometimes overt racism. He was a figure that passengers saw but rarely noticed, a black man doing his job, keeping the city moving forward. He was liked by most passengers. He greeted them with a warm smile, a polite nod, and an unspoken understanding that his job was not just to drive, but to be a quiet presence in a world that often didn't want him to exist. Despite the casual slights, those racist comments whispered under breath, the avoidance of eye contact from some, the hesitant way people sometimes made space for him, Marcus didn't waver. His focus was on the road, his hand firmly gripping the steering wheel. For him, the bus was his sanctuary, the place where he could retreat from the world's injustices, even if only for a few hours. But as he maneuvered the bus through the winding streets, there was always the underlying knowledge that the world outside the doors could be cruel. It was a Tuesday morning, no different than any other, when the bus filled with passengers. The usual faces, some tired from the early morning commute, others glued to their phones, and some looking out the window as the city passed by. Marcus greeted each one with a quiet acknowledgement, slipping into his role with practiced ease. But there was one passenger, someone who didn't fit into the usual rhythm of the commute. He was sitting near the back of the bus, a middle-aged man with a hardened face, his eyes darting around the space as if searching for something to challenge. His clothes were neat but not new, and the way he carried himself spoke of someone who was used to causing trouble, someone who found comfort in tension. As the bus traveled deeper into the city, the man started muttering under his breath. At first, Marcus didn't pay much attention, rude remarks were part of the job. But then the words became clearer, cutting through the air like a blade. "You people think you can do whatever you want," the man sneered, loud enough for those around him to hear. Marcus's grip tightened on the steering wheel, but he said nothing. He had learned long ago that silence was often the safest response. The man's voice grew louder, his words more venomous. "You're all the same, lazy, good for nothing. Just take what you're given." Passengers shifted in their seats, uncomfortable, some avoiding eye contact, others shifting their weight as if hoping the man's attention would turn elsewhere. But Marcus was the target. The bus driver, the black man in the front seat, the one who had done nothing but show up for work and do his job. It was then that the words took a darker turn. The man stood up, staggering slightly as the bus hit a bump in the road. With a sudden, fluid motion, he spat directly onto Marcus's face, the warm saliva landing on his cheek and dripping down onto his shirt. For a moment, time seemed to slow. Marcus could feel the heat of his anger rising, the sense of humiliation and violation crashing over him like a wave. But he didn't react. He stayed still, his mind racing, his pulse quickening. Should he say something? Should he confront this man who had crossed a line that should have never been crossed? Or should he remain silent, as he had always been taught, and simply do his job? His mind flickered to the many moments from his past, those moments when the world had tested his patience, when he had swallowed his pride to avoid conflict. But this was different. He wiped the spit from his face with a napkin from his pocket, trying to maintain his composure, trying to ignore the heat building in his chest. He was a professional, he reminded himself. He was a bus driver, not a warrior, not a crusader. He couldn't afford to make a scene. The bus was full, and the other passengers were watching. There was a moment, just a split second, where he debated whether to turn the bus around, to stop the route, to get off and report the man, but the sense of duty to his job held him back. The decision to let the incident pass was almost instinctual, a decision shaped by years of trying to blend in, to just keep moving forward. But even as he let the moment slide, a voice in his head screamed for him to act. The man's eyes locked with his in that moment, a challenge in them, as if daring Marcus to respond, to retaliate. And for a fleeting second, Marcus considered it. He could stand up. He could make a scene. He could make this man pay for the insult. But instead, Marcus breathed deeply and focused on the road ahead. As the bus continued on its route, the man sat back down, muttering under his breath, but the damage had already been done. The rest of the passengers remained quiet, eyes glued to their phones, pretending nothing had happened. Marcus couldn't shake the feeling, though. It was as if the world had just shifted on its axis, and something deep inside him had been broken. He didn't know it yet, but the decision he was about to make, to report the incident, to face the man who had disrespected him in such a personal way, was about to change everything. If you're still with me, please hit that like button and subscribe to my channel. Your support means the world and keeps these powerful stories coming. The following moments were heavy with silence. The hum of the bus was deafening, and Marcus's grip on the steering wheel grew tighter as he tried to steady his racing thoughts. He had been spat on. In all his years of driving, dealing with countless rude passengers, never had anyone had the audacity to disrespect him like that. It wasn't just the physical act of it, it was the message behind it. The disregard for his humanity, the reduction of him to nothing more than a target of hate. As he drove, the city outside seemed to blur, the usual vibrant life of the streets now faded in his mind. His eyes flickered briefly to the rearview mirror, catching sight of the man in the back who had dared to treat him like that. The passenger, though sitting back now, was still muttering to himself, shaking his head as if everything that had just transpired was somehow Marcus's fault. His words, though muffled by distance, were still unmistakable in their venom. "These people think they own everything," the man growled. A knot twisted in Marcus's stomach. His face was burning. He had never felt so small, so invisible. And yet, despite the indignation that swirled in his chest, he said nothing. The bus rumbled on, its rhythm unchanged, as though nothing had happened at all. His mind raced between two competing thoughts, one, that he needed to confront this man, and two, that doing so might escalate the situation in ways he wasn't prepared for. The passengers on the bus had already shown they would not intervene. For a brief moment, Marcus's eyes scanned the faces of the other riders. The elderly woman who had been dozing off in the corner seat, the young man with earbuds plugged in, the middle-aged woman clutching her purse a little tighter as the man yelled, none of them seemed to know how to react. They all sat in silence, pretending to be deaf to the words being thrown at him. It was as if this was just another day in the life of a black man, enduring the small indignities that society had normalized. His heart sank. Marcus fought the urge to slam his fist against the steering wheel, but his professional training kicked in. He was a bus driver. He was supposed to be the steady hand, the calm in the storm. It was his job to keep things running smoothly, to get the passengers to their destinations safely. He had to remain calm. He had to ignore the hatred coming from behind him. But what about the dignity he had left? The respect he deserved as a human being? Was it worth the risk to his job, his reputation, his sense of self to challenge this passenger? His pulse quickened, but he focused on the task at hand, driving. He couldn't lose himself now. Not over this. The man, noticing that Marcus wasn't reacting, grew bolder. He stood up again, swaying slightly from the motion of the bus. With a quick glance at the passengers, he spat once more, though this time it didn't land anywhere near Marcus. But it didn't matter. The intention was clear. This wasn't about a single action. It was about asserting dominance. It was about making a statement. Marcus's hands clenched tighter around the wheel. He had never wanted to be a symbol. He had never asked for this kind of attention. But as he drove on, the weight of the situation grew heavier. He could feel the eyes of the other passengers on him, the silent judgment, the uncomfortable tension in the air. It was as though everyone was waiting for him to either break or fight back. The bus turned onto the next main street, and Marcus, despite the thoughts swirling in his head, did what he had always done. He kept his eyes on the road, trying to block out the chaos inside his chest. But inside, his heart was pounding. Every breath he took felt labored, heavy with the weight of the man's words and actions. He knew he couldn't just let this go. He had to do something. But what? What would make it right? What could he do? As the bus rolled on, Marcus's mind began to drift back to his past, to those earlier years when he had first learned what it meant to be black in America. He had never been a stranger to racism, but his experience as a young man had been marked by a quiet resistance. Growing up, he had witnessed the pain of his family members, his father, his uncles, his cousins, suffering the consequences of living in a world that valued them less simply because of the color of their skin. He had seen the looks of disdain, the awkward silence, the veiled insults, and the outright hate. But none of it had ever been as brazen as this. None of it had ever been so openly vicious. Marcus's thoughts turned inward. How had he gotten here? What had made him a target today? The memories of growing up in a neighborhood where violence often met resistance replayed in his mind. It was a pattern he'd grown accustomed to. His mother had been adamant that he rise above, that he never give in to hate. But was this how he was supposed to rise above? Was this how he was supposed to show strength? He thought about his wife, Janelle. Her unwavering belief in him, her insistence that he stay strong, stay true. How could he explain to her what had just happened? How could he explain to their two young children why people like the man on his bus thought they could treat him this way? The stoplight ahead flickered red, and Marcus slowly brought the bus to a halt. The shift in motion brought his mind back to the present. He wasn't just a driver anymore. This was more than a job. This was his identity, his dignity, his existence on the line. Marcus had been taught to swallow his pride, to stay silent, to not make waves. But the weight of it all, the constant burden of racial abuse, the humiliation of the spit, the silent complicity of those around him, it all came crashing down on him in that moment. As the bus sat idling at the red light, Marcus took a deep breath. He couldn't let this go. He couldn't stay silent. For too long, he had turned a blind eye to the racism that surrounded him, thinking that if he ignored it, it would go away. But it didn't. It never did. And now, he had a choice to make. The man, still seated in the back, muttered something else, perhaps thinking that Marcus wasn't listening. But Marcus heard it all. He heard the hate. He heard the disrespect. And he knew, deep in his heart, that he could no longer be silent. The light turned green. The bus moved forward again, and Marcus's thoughts sharpened. The decision was made. He wasn't going to let this slide. He would report the incident. He would stand up for himself, for his family, for every black person who had been spat on, beaten down, and told to be quiet. Marcus's hand moved towards the intercom. His voice was steady but firm as he made the announcement to the passengers, his words cutting through the quiet hum of the bus. "I'm pulling over," he said. "I'll be waiting for the police. If anyone has anything to say about what happened, feel free to speak up." The bus continued to roll forward, and the tension in the air thickened. The man in the back shifted uncomfortably, realizing that Marcus wasn't backing down. If you're still with me, please don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to my channel. Your support means a lot and keeps these powerful stories coming. As the bus made its way to the next stop, the weight of the moment settled over Marcus like an avalanche, each passing second adding more pressure to his already overloaded mind. The decision had been made. He would report the incident. But even as the words left his mouth, a new, overwhelming sense of dread began to crawl up his spine. What would happen next? Would his report be taken seriously? Would the police actually do something about it, or would he just be another black man complaining about another racist incident, swept under the rug? He had seen it all before. The disbelief. The indifference. The way complaints like his often ended up dismissed, forgotten. Marcus's mind replayed the events from earlier, over and over again. The spit. The words. The sense of helplessness. His hands gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles turning white. Every nerve in his body felt on edge. The adrenaline from the confrontation began to fade, leaving behind an exhausted emptiness. He'd stood up. He had made a choice. But now, he was faced with a flood of questions he didn't have answers to. Was he doing the right thing? Would it even make a difference? At the next stop, Marcus heard the doors whoosh open and saw the faces of a few familiar passengers stepping off the bus. Some exchanged looks, others didn't make eye contact at all, but not one of them spoke up about what had happened. Not one person expressed sympathy, or even acknowledged the injustice that had just been committed. The silence was deafening, and it made Marcus question everything. Was he really alone in this fight? Was this his burden to carry, or did the passengers have an obligation to stand with him, too? He didn't expect them to take the heat for him, but a simple word, a gesture of solidarity, would have meant the world. As the bus rolled on through the city, the usual faces came and went, each one a silent witness to the events that had unfolded. The man who had spat on him was still sitting in the back, now quiet, his eyes scanning the streets outside the window. Marcus could see him clearly in the rearview mirror, his body stiff, knowing that something had shifted in the air. He was still there, but his presence felt like an intrusion. The whole atmosphere of the bus had changed. The air had thickened with the unsaid. Marcus thought back to his home life. His wife, Janelle, was always a source of strength for him, but even now, as the weight of the situation bore down on him, he wasn't sure how to talk about it. How could he? How could he even begin to explain the hurt, the confusion, the frustration, when the very system he worked for was built to silence him? After finishing the route, Marcus parked the bus at the depot and locked it up. His head throbbed, and his legs felt like jelly, but he knew he couldn't go home like this. He needed to process. He needed to talk to someone who understood what it felt like to walk through this world with the heavy, ever-present weight of racism on your shoulders. He called his friend Chris, a former coworker who had retired years ago, but who still lived in the area. Chris was one of the few people Marcus could talk to openly. They had shared countless hours together, dealing with the same nonsense, the same casual racism that they had both grown accustomed to. But what happened today? That was something different. Marcus didn't know how to even begin explaining it. "Hey, Chris," Marcus said when his friend picked up. "I need to talk. It's about today. You okay?" Chris's voice was immediately concerned. "You sound rattled." "I don't know, man," Marcus replied, leaning back against the side of the bus. "I've had it. Today, I was spat on. Right in front of the whole bus. And the worst part is, nobody said anything. Nobody stood up. They just sat there." A long silence followed before Chris spoke again. "Damn, Marcus. I'm sorry. I can't even imagine how that must have felt. You do the right thing every day, and they treat you like that. I'm thinking about reporting it. I'm thinking about calling the police, but I don't know." I don't know if it's worth it. They'll probably just brush me off. It's like, every time something like this happens, I'm left to pick up the pieces. Like it doesn't matter. You know. I hear you, man, Chris replied softly. But this ain't something you should let slide. You've been doing the right thing all these years. You deserve to be treated like a human being. And I know it feels like it won't make a difference, but if you don't speak up, who will? You've got a chance to make it count, to show that what happened today isn't something we just accept anymore. Marcus closed his eyes, taking in Chris's words. It wasn't the first time he'd heard that kind of encouragement, but something about today made it hit harder. Maybe it was the weight of years of silent suffering finally catching up to him. Maybe it was the indignity of being spat on, a clear violation of his humanity, that made him want to break free from the silence. I just don't know if I'm strong enough for this, Marcus whispered. You don't have to do it alone, Chris reassured him. You've got people behind you. You've got me, you've got your family. And maybe this is bigger than just you, Marcus. Maybe it's about showing the next generation that we don't back down anymore. You're not just a bus driver. You're a man, and your dignity matters. Marcus took a deep breath, his hand gripping the phone tightly. It was a long pause before he spoke again, his voice more resolved. You're right. I'm gonna report it. I'm gonna stand up. I can't keep letting this happen to me, to us. If you're feeling the power of Marcus's story, hit that like button and don't forget to subscribe to my channel. We need more voices like his, voices that stand up and fight for what's right. Let's keep this conversation going. The following morning, Marcus woke up early, determined to take the next step. He spent the morning gathering his thoughts, carefully considering how to present the incident. He knew it wouldn't be easy. The mental toll of reporting racial abuse, especially when it had been so publicly humiliating, was immense. He wondered whether his coworkers would support him or if they'd brush him off as overreacting, just as they always had when other incidents occurred. But today, he was resolved. He wasn't backing down. He would stand up for himself and for the countless others who had suffered in silence, just like him. By the time he arrived at the bus depot, Marcus had already made up his mind to speak to his supervisor. He couldn't keep this inside. He had to report it. He had to ensure that something was done, that this kind of behavior would not go unchecked. The world needed to know that this was unacceptable, and it started with him. As he walked through the doors of the depot, he felt a strange sense of empowerment. It wasn't easy, nothing about standing up for what was right ever was, but it was necessary. For him, for his community, for his family. The next few days were a blur. Marcus found himself consumed by the aftermath of the incident. He went through the motions, handling the bus routes as usual, but his mind was elsewhere. The images of the passenger spitting on him, the sound of the words, vile and drenched with hatred, echoed constantly in his thoughts. His resolve to report the incident had been the first step, but now that it was done, the real challenge began. He had called the police, and the initial contact had been brief. A calm voice on the other end of the line had listened to his account, assuring him that an officer would be assigned to investigate. But as Marcus hung up the phone, a sense of doubt crept in. Would they really take him seriously? How many times had the system failed black men like him before? He had heard too many stories of how cases like his got lost in the shuffle, how complaints of racial abuse were often dismissed as minor offenses, nothing more than petty squabbles. It wasn't until he arrived at work the following day that he began to see the first signs of change. His supervisor, a man named Doug, called him into his office. Doug was a middle-aged white man, always polite but distant, and often seemed hesitant when it came to matters involving race. Still, Marcus had never felt entirely unsupported by him, even if Doug rarely spoke up against the casual racism that occurred in their shared workplace. Doug met Marcus's eyes as he sat down in front of his desk, the tension between them thick. "I'm glad you decided to report it," Doug said, breaking the silence. But I gotta tell you, this isn't going to be easy. You know how things go around here, right? Marcus nodded, feeling a pang in his chest. Doug wasn't wrong. The system was set up to protect the status quo, and challenging that status quo was never simple. I know, Marcus replied quietly, but it has to be done. I'm not letting this go. Doug leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. Well, we'll back you up as best we can. I've talked to the higher-ups, and they'll support you with whatever's needed. But, there's something you should know. The guy who did this to you, his name's Jason Reynolds. He's got a history, Marcus. And not just with the law. This guy's been tied to some really shady people. You might want to brace yourself for what's coming. Marcus's heart skipped a beat. Shady people? What do you mean? Doug's voice lowered, his eyes scanning the room as if to make sure no one was listening. I don't have all the details, but I've heard whispers. He's been linked to a local extremist group, one that's been involved in several hate crimes around the city. They've been active for years. Trust me, Marcus, this isn't just some random act. This guy's got a network, and it's bigger than any of us realized. The word struck Marcus like a slap to the face. He had always known that racism ran deep, but this revelation felt like a personal attack. This wasn't just an individual's ignorance or anger. This was part of something much darker, something much more dangerous. The notion that Jason Reynolds was connected to an extremist group, people who lived their lives spewing hatred, targeting people like Marcus, was chilling. I didn't expect this, Marcus said, his voice tight. I thought it was just some angry guy having a bad day. Doug sighed, rubbing his temples. I wish that's all it was. But it's worse than that, Marcus. You're dealing with a system. And it's going to be tough. But you're not alone in this. I promise you that. The conversation lingered in Marcus's mind long after he left Doug's office. He had hoped that the incident would remain an isolated incident, something he could put behind him with a report and a few words. But now, as he learned more about the man who had humiliated him, the situation felt far more complicated. This wasn't just a racial incident, it was a battle against a network of hate that sought to control the narrative of the world around him. The investigation into Jason Reynolds' background began almost immediately. Police gathered surveillance footage from the bus route, where they saw the confrontation unfold in full detail. The spit, the insults, every word captured on video. They spoke with witnesses, some of whom refused to make a statement, while others spoke cautiously, aware of the potential danger of involving themselves. Slowly, the evidence against Reynolds began to mount. As the investigation deepened, police officers unearthed a disturbing pattern. Reynolds wasn't just a random passenger with a bad attitude, he had been a member of an organized hate group for years. His criminal record was lengthy, including charges of assault and violent behavior. He had been involved in multiple incidents of racial harassment and had even been arrested for assaulting a black man at a protest just months earlier. The more the officers dug, the clearer it became, Reynolds was a product of a larger culture of hate and violence that had infiltrated their community. It was around this time that Marcus was contacted by Officer Daniels, the lead investigator in the case. She was a white woman, confident and sharp, with a no-nonsense attitude that immediately put Marcus at ease. Mr. Cole, Officer Daniels said during their first phone conversation, I'm looking into Mr. Reynolds' background. This isn't just a case of a disgruntled passenger. This man has been active in multiple incidents of racial violence. We have enough evidence to move forward, but we'll need your full cooperation. Marcus hesitated for a moment before responding. I didn't know it was this serious, Officer Daniels. I thought it was just some guy having a bad day. But now I see. I see that there's more to it. There's always more to it, Mr. Cole, Officer Daniels replied firmly. People like Reynolds don't just act alone. They're part of a system, a network that seeks to tear us apart. That's why we need to take this seriously. We need to make sure that what happened to you doesn't happen to anyone else. Marcus took a deep breath, the gravity of the situation settling in. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about sending a message. It was about standing up for his community, for the people who had been too afraid to speak out, for everyone who had suffered in silence. He had been spat on, humiliated, targeted for who he was, but now, he had a chance to do something about it. As Officer Daniels continued her investigation, she revealed more about the extremist group Jason Reynolds had been tied to. The group had been operating under the radar for years, subtly influencing local politics and spreading a toxic, divisive ideology. It wasn't just about hate speech, they had ties to acts of violence, intimidation, and even plans to disrupt community events and peaceful protests. The more Marcus learned, the more determined he became to bring Reynolds to justice. The weight of the situation became clearer with every passing day. The investigation had gone from something that felt personal to something much larger, a fight against a deeply entrenched system of hate. It was a battle that Marcus wasn't sure he was ready for, but one that he knew he had to fight, no matter the cost. If you're following Marcus's journey and want to see how it all unfolds, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Stay with us, because the road to justice isn't easy, but together, we can make it happen. The days following Officer Daniels's contact with Marcus were filled with tension and uncertainty. The investigation had gained momentum, but it wasn't without its challenges. The group Reynolds was involved with had deep roots, and their influence was far-reaching. But Marcus refused to back down. He had started something, and he was going to see it through. It was a pivotal moment. Marcus was no longer just a bus driver. He was a symbol, a representative of the countless men and women who had faced racial injustice in silence for too long. He had made the choice to confront it head-on, and no matter how difficult the road ahead seemed, he knew he was doing the right thing. The days turned into weeks, and with each passing moment, the stakes grew higher. Jason Reynolds's case continued to unfold in the press, with public interest peaking as the details of his connections to an extremist hate group began to surface. What had initially seemed like a routine incident of racial abuse had become a focal point for discussions on systemic racism, hate crimes, and the broader societal issues that plagued their community. As the investigation progressed, it became clear that Marcus Cole's story was much more than just an isolated incident. It was a testament to the everyday struggles faced by Black people in a world that often ignored their pain. The courtroom was where everything would come to a head. When the trial finally began, Marcus stood outside the courthouse, facing the building where so much history had unfolded. He had prepared himself for this moment, but nothing could have prepared him for the weight of walking into that space, knowing that his fight would be scrutinized by the world. This was no longer just about his personal ordeal. It was about something much larger, something that would send ripples throughout the city and beyond. As Marcus stepped inside the courthouse, he was met by Officer Daniels, who had become a steadfast ally throughout the entire process. She had been his constant source of support, keeping him updated on the case, ensuring his safety, and helping him navigate the complexities of the legal system. "You ready for this?" she asked, her voice steady but sympathetic. Marcus nodded, his heart racing. "I don't know if anyone is ever really ready for something like this. But I'm here. And I won't back down." The courtroom was packed with spectators. The trial had garnered significant media attention, and people from all walks of life had come to witness the proceedings. The tension in the room was palpable as Marcus took a seat in the witness stand, preparing to recount the events of that fateful day. His hands trembled, but he steadied himself. This wasn't just for him, it was for everyone who had suffered in silence. The prosecutor, a seasoned attorney named Angela Reed, stood to begin her opening statement. She was a woman with a commanding presence, her words sharp and direct. As she spoke, her gaze frequently shifted to Marcus, as if acknowledging the profound impact this case had on his life. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, "today, we are not just here to decide the fate of one man. We are here to address a much larger issue, the issue of racial hatred that has been allowed to fester in this community for far too long. Jason Reynolds, a man with a long history of violent behavior and ties to extremist groups, is accused of committing a hate crime against Marcus Cole, a man simply trying to do his job. This trial is not just about the actions of one individual, it's about the systemic racism that continues to harm and oppress marginalized communities. And it's about holding people like Jason Reynolds accountable. Angela Reed's words echoed through the courtroom, and Marcus felt a surge of pride and relief. It was the first time he had heard someone in such a formal setting speak so directly about the racism that had plagued his life. He wasn't alone in this fight, he had an ally in the system, someone who truly understood the weight of the battle he was facing. Jason Reynolds' defense attorney, a man named Michael Turner, took the floor next. He was calm, calculated, and his words were laced with condescension. He tried to undermine Marcus's credibility, casting doubt on his version of events, attempting to paint him as overly sensitive and prone to exaggeration. Turner even went so far as to imply that Marcus had provoked the altercation by simply doing his job, driving the bus. "This is a simple misunderstanding," Turner argued. Mr. Reynolds, a man who has faced numerous challenges in his life, reacted out of frustration. "It's clear that Mr. Cole's actions were a contributing factor to the incident. He, too, played a part in what happened that day. The defendant should not be judged solely on the basis of this isolated event." Marcus's stomach churned as he listened to the defense's argument. He had expected it, had known that they would try to deflect blame onto him. But it still stung to hear the insinuations that he had somehow been at fault for simply existing as a black man in a public space. Still, he held his ground. His story was truth, and no matter how much they tried to distort it, he knew what had happened. The trial stretched on for days, with witness testimonies, expert opinions, and mounting evidence. Surveillance footage of the incident was shown again and again, each time more damning than the last. The spitting, the verbal assault, the malicious intent in Reynolds' actions, it was all there in stark detail. But it wasn't just the footage that weighed on the jury, it was the testimony of the bystanders. Several people who had been on the bus that day came forward to share their stories, and their words were powerful. Some had initially hesitated to speak up, fearing retaliation or being caught in the crossfire of an already tense situation. But now, with the trial in full swing, they found the courage to tell the truth. One witness, a woman named Patricia Davis, stood up in front of the jury, her voice shaking but resolute. She had been sitting near the back of the bus that day and had witnessed the entire altercation. "I saw the whole thing," she said, her eyes red from tears. "Mr. Cole didn't do anything to provoke him. Mr. Reynolds, he was already angry when he got on the bus. He said some terrible things to Marcus, things I won't repeat here. And then he spit on him. I couldn't believe it. I've never seen anything like that before. It was pure hate. I don't care what anyone says, no one deserves to be treated that way." Her words struck the jury like a hammer. It was one thing to watch the footage, but it was another to hear someone who had been there, someone who had seen the truth with her own eyes. Patricia's testimony carried weight, and it shifted the momentum of the trial. As the days wore on, the pressure mounted. Jason Reynolds' supporters began to gather outside the courthouse, some holding signs and chanting in his defense. But the message that was coming through loud and clear was that hatred had no place in their community. More and more people rallied behind Marcus, showing up at rallies, donating to his legal fund, and sharing their own stories of racial injustice. The turning point came when Officer Daniels took the stand. She spoke not only about the details of her investigation into Reynolds' background but also about the impact of the hate group he was affiliated with. She explained how these groups operated with the intent to perpetuate violence and spread division, and how they often preyed on individuals like Reynolds, disenfranchised, angry, and vulnerable. "The actions of Jason Reynolds are not isolated," Officer Daniels said, her voice steady. "He's part of something much larger. He is a product of a system that has allowed these groups to thrive in the shadows, unchecked. But we have the power to change that. We have the power to stop this from happening again. The courtroom went silent as her words sank in. For Marcus, it felt like the final piece of the puzzle had fallen into place. This wasn't just about one man. This was about the fight against the system that allowed such hate to persist, unchecked and unchallenged. This was his fight, yes, but it was also the fight of every person who had ever suffered because of the color of their skin. The closing arguments would be the next step. The jury would deliberate, and the weight of their decision would carry far beyond the walls of that courtroom. For Marcus, the outcome of the trial was uncertain, but there was one thing he knew for sure: he had already won. He had stood up, told his story, and in doing so, had forced the world to acknowledge the truth of his experience. And no matter what happened next, the world could never go back to the way it was before. As the days passed and the final arguments were made, Marcus's anxiety grew. The weight of the trial had taken its toll, and even though he had done everything in his power to bring the truth to light, there was still a nagging uncertainty that lingered. The jury would soon decide his fate, decide whether the brutal truth of what had happened would be acknowledged or dismissed. And, in the back of his mind, he wondered how the outcome might influence future cases of racial violence. After closing arguments, the judge instructed the jury to deliberate. The room grew heavy with anticipation. Marcus sat with his family and friends, feeling the pressure of the moment. His mother, his siblings, Officer Daniels, and his lawyer, Angela Reed, were all there. They had stood by him through every moment of this ordeal, providing the emotional strength he needed to continue. They were all too familiar with the struggles black people faced in a society that often failed to protect them. But despite their unwavering support, the reality of the situation still weighed heavily on Marcus. What if the jury didn't see things the way he and so many others had? What if justice wasn't served? Days passed as the jury deliberated. The uncertainty gnawed at Marcus. He found it hard to sleep, replaying every moment of the incident in his mind. He thought about the way Reynolds had looked at him, like he was less than human. He thought about the spit that had landed on his face, a symbol of the vile hatred Reynolds carried with him. And he thought about all the moments he had spent in his life, trying to rise above the racial discrimination that followed him like a shadow. The moment in the bus had been a breaking point, a moment when he could no longer ignore the systemic injustice around him. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the jury returned to the courtroom. The room was filled with tense silence as the foreman stood and read the verdict aloud. We, the jury, find the defendant, Jason Reynolds, guilty of committing a hate crime against Marcus Cole, and guilty of assault. Marcus's heart pounded in his chest. The words he had hoped for but never fully allowed himself to believe echoed in his mind. Guilty. The sound of it felt like a weight lifting off his shoulders, but it was also accompanied by a deep sense of relief. For the first time in a long time, he felt as if his suffering had been seen, not just by those who knew him personally, but by the wider community. And it wasn't just his victory, it was a victory for every person who had ever been discriminated against because of their skin color. The courtroom erupted into applause. People were on their feet, cheering, crying, clapping, emotionally overwhelmed by the outcome. Marcus looked around, his eyes filled with tears, as he saw the faces of his family and friends. Officer Daniels gave him a nod of approval, a silent acknowledgement that they had fought a good fight. Angela Reed, his lawyer, was standing at the front of the room, her face a mixture of triumph and relief. But even as the relief swept over him, Marcus knew the battle wasn't over. The case may have been won, but the fight against racism would continue long after the verdict was read. There would be others like him, people who were spat upon, belittled, and dehumanized simply because of the color of their skin. The system, though it had shown signs of progress, still had deep flaws. He wasn't naive enough to think that one case would change everything. But he had planted a seed that could one day grow into something more. As the cheers faded and the reality of the verdict set in, Marcus stood up from his seat and walked out of the courtroom, his shoulders a little straighter than they had been when he walked in. His journey was far from over, but this moment felt like a turning point, a crucial victory that would echo through his life and through the lives of many others. In the days following the trial, the case continued to dominate the headlines. News outlets across the country covered the verdict, many hailing it as a significant moment in the fight against hate crimes. Some focused on the fact that it had been the courage of a single individual, Marcus Cole, that had brought Jason Reynolds' actions into the light. Others noted that the trial had exposed a growing societal divide, one that could no longer be ignored. But regardless of the angle, one thing was clear: this trial had sparked a conversation that needed to happen. For Marcus, however, the aftermath was both empowering and challenging. He had been thrust into the spotlight, and while he appreciated the support, he knew that this newfound fame would come with its own challenges. The pressure to be a voice for an entire community would weigh on him in ways he hadn't fully anticipated. He wasn't just an individual now, he was a symbol. And symbols, he knew, were often both revered and scrutinized. As he continued to navigate his new reality, Marcus found solace in his family and his community. They were there, as they had always been, offering him strength and understanding. His mother, in particular, expressed pride in him, not just for winning the case, but for standing up to an unjust system. "You did more than just defend yourself, Marcus. You stood for all of us," she told him one evening as they sat together at the dinner table, the weight of everything still heavy on his heart. "Sometimes, it feels like I'm just one person," Marcus said softly. "Like I'm not doing enough." "You've done more than you think," she replied, her voice steady and filled with conviction. "You've made people listen. And that's the first step in change." And it was true. Marcus had ignited a spark. From grassroots organizations to online activists, people had rallied around the case. Social media was filled with hashtags and posts celebrating the guilty verdict, but more importantly, they celebrated the fact that Marcus had stood up for himself and for everyone who had suffered in silence for far too long. But not everyone was celebrating. Reynolds' supporters, those who believed in his distorted version of reality, launched counter-protests, arguing that the case was an example of a biased justice system, and that Reynolds had been wrongly convicted. These voices, though loud, were ultimately drowned out by the larger chorus of support that Marcus had garnered. In the months that followed, the legal system took further steps to address the broader issues of hate crimes and racial violence. New policies were introduced in the city aimed at increasing accountability for hate-driven actions, and community outreach programs were developed to foster understanding and solidarity among different racial groups. While these steps were significant, Marcus knew that real change would take time, and that the fight was far from over. As for him, he became a beacon for others. People came to him with their stories of racial abuse, discrimination, and injustice. And while he didn't have all the answers, he knew that by sharing his story, he had helped give others the courage to speak out as well. In the end, that was what mattered most. Marcus had proven to himself and to the world that one person's voice could make a difference, and that, perhaps, was the most powerful victory of all. The road ahead would be long. But for the first time in a long time, Marcus felt hopeful. As the days turned into weeks, the victory that Marcus had fought so hard for began to feel more and more like a distant echo. Though the guilty verdict against Reynolds brought relief, the road to real change, as Marcus understood, would not be paved overnight. The media's attention eventually waned, as it always did. The fleeting nature of news cycles made Marcus reflect on something his mother had said to him during the trial. "You did more than just defend yourself, Marcus. You made people listen." And so, Marcus began to realize that the aftermath was just as important as the trial itself. He wasn't just fighting a battle of legalities, but a battle of perception and culture, a battle to shift the tides of a deeply ingrained societal issue that many had turned a blind eye to. To him, the true measure of success was not just in the conviction, but in the lasting impact it had on the minds of people who, until that moment, had been oblivious to the everyday reality of racial injustice. In the weeks following the trial, Marcus's phone buzzed constantly with messages of support from friends, family, and even strangers who had seen the media coverage. At first, the constant barrage of well-wishes was overwhelming, but slowly, he began to embrace his role as a symbol for justice. He felt a profound sense of responsibility to carry this torch for others who might not have the strength to fight for themselves. But as much as Marcus was uplifted by the voices of solidarity, there were darker moments too. Reynolds's supporters had not remained silent. As expected, a wave of backlash surfaced in various corners of the community. Online platforms became flooded with toxic comments, from people who either dismissed the incident entirely or tried to justify Reynolds's actions as just a misunderstanding. Some even went as far as to accuse Marcus of being overly sensitive or seeking attention. These comments, though hurtful, were not new to Marcus. He had dealt with this kind of rhetoric his entire life, and he had learned to brush it off. But still, the vitriol stung. It was a reminder that even a legal victory couldn't erase the deeply rooted prejudices that persisted in society. One afternoon, while scrolling through his social media accounts, Marcus came across a post from someone who claimed to be a member of the extremist group Reynolds had been linked to. The post was full of hateful rhetoric, calling for revenge against Marcus and others who defy the natural order. The words were chilling, but what bothered Marcus the most was the realization that Reynolds's actions were not just an isolated incident, they were part of a larger network of hatred and violence. The trial had been a victory, yes, but Marcus now understood that this was a battle in a much larger war. With this new understanding, Marcus took to using his platform to address the issue head-on. He began posting messages of hope, resilience, and unity, trying to drown out the negativity with positivity. He encouraged others to share their stories, to speak out against racial injustice, and to demand accountability from those in power. His message was simple: we are stronger together, and our voices will not be silenced. As Marcus continued his advocacy, he became more involved in local activism. He worked with community organizations that focused on racial justice and police reform, attending meetings, and speaking at rallies. Though he never sought out fame or recognition, Marcus became a well-known figure in the movement for racial equality. He never imagined his name would be associated with anything other than his job as a bus driver, yet here he was, standing at the front lines of a fight that was bigger than himself. Through it all, Marcus found strength in his family. His mother continued to be his rock, providing him with the unwavering love and support he needed to keep pushing forward. His siblings, too, were proud of him. They saw the changes happening around them, the conversations that were being had, the awareness that was being raised, and they knew that their brother had played a significant role in making that possible. Still, Marcus couldn't help but feel a sense of exhaustion. The emotional toll of the trial had left him drained. The constant scrutiny, the pressure to be a perfect representative of the black community, it all weighed on him. There were days when he felt like he was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. He often wondered if he was doing enough or if he was just one person fighting an impossible battle. He questioned whether his actions would lead to real change or whether it would all be in vain. Then one evening, as he sat with his wife, Layla, in their small living room, he confided in her. "I'm tired," he said softly. "I don't know if I can keep doing this. It feels like I'm just one person, and this fight is too big. I don't want to disappoint anyone, but sometimes I feel like I'm not enough." Layla looked at him with understanding in her eyes. She had seen the toll the trial had taken on him, the sleepless nights, the constant anxiety. She had witnessed his internal struggle and the emotional weight of his newfound role. "Marcus," she said gently, "you are enough. You have done something that many people would never have the courage to do. You've shown people that it's okay to stand up for what's right, no matter the cost. You've inspired so many, including me." Her words gave him the strength to continue, and for the first time in a while, Marcus allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he was making a difference. The fight for justice was far from over, but he wasn't alone. He had his family, his community, and the countless others who were fighting alongside him. As Marcus continued his work in activism, things slowly began to change in the city. The local government, spurred by the media coverage and public outrage over the trial, began implementing policies to combat hate crimes more aggressively. Police officers underwent sensitivity training, and community outreach programs were expanded to foster understanding between law enforcement and minority groups. While these changes were small, they marked the beginning of a shift in the right direction. But Marcus knew that the real work lay ahead. He had won a battle, but the war against racial injustice was ongoing. There would be more cases like his, more struggles, more voices that needed to be heard. And as long as he had the strength, Marcus would continue to fight, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been silenced, marginalized, or oppressed because of the color of their skin. In the months and years that followed, Marcus's story became an inspiration to many. His name was spoken with respect and admiration in the community, and his courage continued to serve as a beacon of hope for those still fighting against racism and hate. His legacy was one of resilience, strength, and the unwavering belief that one person, no matter how ordinary they seemed, could spark a change that ripples across generations. As he walked through the city streets, Marcus often saw the faces of young people, black and brown, looking at him with a sense of pride and hope. They didn't know the full story, but they knew that he had fought for something bigger than himself. And in their eyes, that was enough. The fight against racism and injustice, though long and difficult, had been made a little easier because of Marcus's bravery. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear: as long as there were people like Marcus willing to stand up, the battle for equality would never end. And maybe, just maybe, one day, the world would be a place where no one would have to fear the hate that had once threatened to consume him. Marcus stood tall, knowing that his journey was far from over. But as he looked ahead, he saw a future where change was possible, a future where the legacy of his actions would live on in the hearts of those who had witnessed his courage and, most importantly, in the hearts of those who would never forget the lesson he had taught, that standing up for what is right is never easy, but it is always worth it. As Marcus's story reminds us, the fight against racism and injustice does not end with a single victory. It is a continuous journey that requires all of us to stand together, to raise our voices, and to demand change. Marcus may have taken that first step, but it is up to all of us to keep moving forward. If you have been inspired by Marcus's courage, now is the time to act. It starts with standing up when you witness injustice, no matter how small it may seem. Speak out against racism, whether it's in your community, workplace, or even on social media. Educate yourself and those around you about the issues that affect marginalized groups. Support organizations and movements that are actively working for racial equality, and use your privilege to amplify the voices of those who are often silenced. You don't have to be a public figure or have a platform to make a difference. Each individual action creates a ripple effect, leading to real change. Whether you choose to engage in activism, have tough conversations with loved ones, or simply listen to those whose voices are too often ignored, you are playing a crucial role in the fight for justice. Let Marcus's story be a reminder that change is possible, but it requires all of us to take part. Don't wait for someone else to do it. Be the change you wish to see in the world, and together, we can create a future where every person is treated with the dignity and respect they deserve. Stand up. Speak out. And never stop fighting for what is right. If you want to see more stories like this and be part of a movement for change, make sure to like this video and subscribe. You don't want to miss what's coming next.